Okay, so I think we should start. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Asaf Siniver. I'm the chair of the Diplomatic Studies section of ISA. I'm a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham, and I'm also co-editor of the Journal of Global Security Studies. Today's event is the first event in a series of virtual activities that the section will be running this year. And we've already got another event planned ahead for February the 8th, where we will have a virtual roundtable on publishing your research on diplomacy in peer-reviewed journal, where we will have contributions from editors of leading journals such as International Affairs, Cooperation and Conflict, the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, and the European Journal of International Relations. We have a few other activities lined up for the remaining of the year, and you can find the details on the monthly ISA newsletters. If you do have any idea for a virtual event that you'd like to run through the section, whether it's a book launch, a policy roundtable, an event aimed primarily at early career scholars and so on, please feel free to drop me a line. So the topic of today's panel is deliberately broad, and it concerns global South perspectives on the current state of US-China relations, both academically and policy-wise. Before I present our speakers today, just a few house rules. So we've asked each panelist to speak for roughly 10 to 12 minutes. We have an hour and a half, which should give us plenty of time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions for the panel, please use either the chat box or the Q&A function. I'll introduce our speakers in the order of appearance. Unfortunately, Clara Weinhardt, one of our speakers, will not be able to join us because she's unwell. So we'll have 5 presenters. First in order is Inderjeet Parmar, who is a professor of international politics and associate dean of research in the School of Policy and Global Affairs at City University of London. Inderjeet is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a columnist at The Wire. He is an international fellow of the Rhodes Initiative think tank in Islamabad, and is the author of several books, including Foundations of the American Century. He is currently writing a book on the history, politics, and powers of the US foreign policy establishment. Our second speaker will be Wang, my colleague at the University of Birmingham. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and International Studies. Prior to taking up his position at Birmingham, he served as an assistant professor at Waseda University, as well as a postdoctoral research position at the University of Manchester. And his research focuses on memory politics, nationalism, international security, and political communication. Our third speaker is Dawisson Lopes, who is a professor of international and comparative politics at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and a research fellow at the National Council for Technological and Scientific Development in Brazil. He served as a visiting academic at the University of Oxford's Latin American Center from March 22 to March 23. Jyhjong Wang is a PhD candidate in political science at Ohio State University. She specializes in China-Africa relations. She's also a pre-doctoral research fellow at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, where she works on the Chinese Loans to Africa database. She is formerly the senior research assistant at China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Excuse me. And finally, Ahmad Rizky Umar is a sessional lecturer at the school. Excuse me, losing my voice. Ahmad is a sessional lecturer at the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. He obtained his PhD from the University of Queensland in 2022 with a thesis on the idea of Asia in world politics. He is interested in Asian security, Southeast Asian regionalism, and Indonesia's foreign policy. So after this long introduction, and before I completely lose my voice, I will turn to Inderjeet, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Asaf, for this kind introduction, and also for organizing this event, and obviously for inviting me to share some of my thoughts. You very kindly said we don't have to prepare anything in advance, we can just think off the top of our heads, which is very good reverse psychology, I think, which made me think a bit more deeply about the subject than I might otherwise have in any case. But I'm very glad to be here and to share some of my thoughts. Now, my talk is entitled, or my talking points are entitled Global Change in Progress, but the United States remains the pivotal state, yet it's an increasingly challenged pivotal state. It's a very descriptive title for my talk. And in this talk, basically I make 5 contextual points and 3 more specific points. And the net import of my points is that the world situation, Sino-US relations and Sino-US relations in the context of the global South, that the whole world situation is messy, it's contradictory, ambiguous, and therefore unstable and unpredictable. But we can see that the world is heading towards greater and more serious domestic and geopolitical conflict, including danger of catastrophic warfare on a greater scale, and that pivotal in all this is the greatest power in the world at this time, the United States. And I would argue that methodologically, placing the United States as either a driver or non-driver, proactive or non-active, is an effective way of considering the movements and directions of world politics. Now, within the context of my of those sort of serious and escalating crises, which is a kind of message of doom and gloom, I think overall, I would say that there are sort of 3 points of light that I could identify which give us a little bit more hope than I might in my presentation. The first one is complex interpenetration of the world economy and societies. The second is popular resistance to crises. And the third is elite self-correction as well as skilled diplomacy. So as Antonio Gramsci would say, I've tried to promote a little bit of pessimism of the intellect, but also optimism of the will, that we as scholars and citizens have that power to challenge and change things as well ourselves. Now, the specific context for the discussion I want to sort of put on the table are the 2 reports. One is Oxfam's report on inequality, which just came out before Davos meetings. And the second is the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report 2024. That's the context from which my main points are derived. Now, 5 contextual points. The first one is that we have 2 major global powers that both claim to be anti-colonial and anti-imperial because of their respective historical experiences, yet both, I would say, are global reachers. That is, that the United States, however, is ahead of the game, and China is a more recent entrant to the kind of global reach great power status. Secondly, we've got a world which is characterized by crisis in every sphere and domain, whether we call it a poly crisis, a perma crisis, or an organic crisis. The language today is all about crisis. Of course, crisis as a term needs unpacking, which we may be able to do later on, but nevertheless, that is the language in which the world is described today. Now, part of the reason why the crisis language is so significant is to do with increasing concentrations of wealth, income, and technological power in the hands of relatively few individuals, corporations, and states. And we're in a situation where most people in the world have very little, and the conditions of life of the lower and middle income people are diminishing even further. Secondly, we call it a world of crisis because of the domestic polarizations and factionalization, rise of right-wing movements and state authoritarianism, which is occurring and appears to be increasing in momentum. And thirdly, we have a world characterized by a language of crisis because of interstate geopolitical rivalries and outright conflict and war, which has already broken out in some regions, and there's greater risks of more to come. And the third point I would make, the contextual point I would make, is that the pivotal state in the world exemplifies the current state of the world itself. Crisis at home and in the US-led world system in an election year. And it's a year in which billions of people go to the polls this year alone. That is to say, the United States as the lead state is in a state of crisis at home and in its system as well. The fourth contextual point I would make is that the tensions between forces for an integrative world economy and the forces for the self-sovereign nation state represent the core driver of conflict, but also of competition, as well as possibilities of cooperation and all the possibilities that may offer. Fifthly, the contextual point is that diplomacy and statesmanship are more needed than ever. Diplomacy matters of whatever kind that is available, whether it's official, unofficial, semi-official, track to or back channels, which is to say that although there are these very large-scale factors and forces and structural conditions, that is, agency still matters a great deal, and agency can, exercised by masses of people who are resisting, elite self-correction, diplomats, and others, can be influential and has to be influential in order to try to ameliorate or mitigate some of the really terrible conditions which the world is going through at the moment. Three more specific points which kind of derive from the analysis that I've just provided is the first is that China is not a revolutionary power in world affairs. It is a far cry from the 1950s to 1970s period when it backed national liberation movements, including in Africa, against Western interests. And the processes through which China transited and transitioned from a revolutionary power to a power which operates largely within the liberal international order, the process through which this happened, the USA and the West played key roles. And that is to say that China is more or less thoroughly integrated into the liberal order, its markets and wealth accumulations, and therefore many of its issues and problems, particularly inequalities. The second specific point is that there is no ideological split in great power world politics. So there is no objective Cold War, but relationships across regions are undergoing flux and change. There is more choice or multi-alignment opportunities, which China's power and other regional powers status has given, that China's power, wealth and power and reach now provide an alternative to other states and regions, as do the other BRICS, which I would argue is a broadening of the basis of global oligarchy, or what some people are calling a relatively minor democratization of world politics. The third point that I would make, just continuing that second specific point, is that China and global South middle powers, elites, are self-interested and integrated and seek further enhanced powers within the order, within the liberal international order, even if that displaces the United States and the West from their central positions. The BRICS themselves have resulted from integrative processes from the 1970s, especially the management of demands from the post-colonial states in the G77 for a new international economic order in the 1970s, with concessions rather than radical redistributions of power. That is to say that some of the structural forces which are leading the world towards multiplexity or multipolarity, or whatever that messy thing that we're going into is called, those processes are long-standing and were participated in, and in fact, you could say almost midwifed by the West and the United States in particular in the 1970s and 1980s. The third specific point I would make is that the main problems in the world today are internal or domestic. These are legitimacy crises of inequality, of polarization in politics, including the use of racism and populism for the purpose of divide and rule, the use of authoritarian government laws, etc., to uphold domestic elite power. Dangers of large-scale domestic discontent are affecting global relations and possible conflicts over economic shares and global status and influence. There is a strong feeling among many observers that we are in something resembling 1910 to 1914, the situation between 1910 and 1914 historically, and or 1937 or 1938, but without empire blocks and more global institutions and mechanisms for cooperation and diplomacy, but a lot more technological power to be able to effect large-scale global catastrophes as well. So this crisis, whether we call it polycrisis, permacrisis, or organic crisis, as I argue, is most acute in the United States as the pivotal power, and therefore with the greatest global reverberations, especially in a major election year for the United States and around the globe. Okay, I'll stop there. I've probably used my 12 minutes already.
That's great. Thank you, Inderjeet. It's an excellent way to start the panel, and a brownie point already for sticking to your time limit. Very impressive. Yi, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Asaf, and thank you, Professor Parmar. I think your talk is very interesting for me. Today, my talk will be focused on the image of America in China, or how China views America. I think this is a very broad topic, so I can only really briefly explain a few important points. First of all, as we know that in the Cold War era, at least from 1949 to 1972, for these 3 decades, basically the dominant discourse in China is regarding America is that it is an enemy, or you can say that anti-Americanism was the dominant narratives in Chinese politics. Nevertheless, from 1972, when Nixon was invited to China, the propaganda regarding America has been dramatically changed. Well, in very different ways. First of all, this kind of anti-American discourse had been turned down to a large degree. And second, gradually, especially after the China started the reform and opening up in 1978, American gradually became a kind of a pioneer of modernization or economic growth development model for China. So I should say from 1970 and 1980s, the image of America in China started to become much more ambiguous. The ambiguity means there are 2 very different or conflictual images of America in China. The first of all, the first image is that it is a very advanced capitalist developed society, and its technology is admirable, and many things China can learn from. And I think this image still stays until today. And second, on the other hand, the old image of America as an imperialist power, or as I should say, well, the villain in the game of world politics, has been remaining to some extent. Depending on history periods, there could be up and down with this kind of image change. But although the China has officially stopped using the word American imperialism in 1980s, American hegemony, or you can use the word in very Chinese like American hegemonism, has become a dominant concept to frame America in a more negative way, usually regarding the politics and diplomacy. So this kind of ambiguous image, I should say it has been kind of remained until today. I should say in 1990s and 2000s, for the 2 decades, Beijing is balancing this kind of 2 different images of America in China. So, for example, if the 2 countries really get close, perhaps there will be more positive narrative of America appear in Chinese media, vice versa. However, there's a very important change in China in 2000s. That is the rise of internet and social media. Just like the social media did in many other countries, in China from that time, there was a dividing opinions about America appeared on internet. The first is group people who are more conservative and nationalist. So they are still very radically anti-America. A second kind of group opinion is more liberal, who perhaps they show more admiration or respect for America, including its democracy. And they also want China to open door more to America and to the Western world, and to better engage in American lead international order. But in recent decades, such a liberal voice has been largely silenced. And the more nationalist voice for last decade has been very, very, how to say that, very, significant, or you can say very noisy on the internet, or also on many other mainstream media. This is partly because the emerging conflict between the two countries over trade war during Trump administration, and now even though the Biden administration in recent years, the Beijing and Washington getting closer a little bit, or they want to reduce the tension sometimes, but this kind of conflictual discourse remains. And there are two other important change regarding how America is or which position America is now in the world politics in China. So the first is the declinism. That is what discourse, well, first fashioned in the United States or in the Western world, but now it's well represented in Chinese media or context too. So in that way, a number of Chinese media or social media talking about the decline of America and the rise of China. As we said, that the kind of the east wind is is surpassing the western wind, as in Maoist era. And the second important change is the rise of Trumpism. So the rise of Trump and his own discourse have a pretty complicated impact on Chinese public opinion. So on the one hand, it seems that reinforced that the declinism among the public in China. And second, I should say many liberals in China could feel more disappointed with America in a way that they could buy in the Trumpist discourse. What I mean here is that before, for example, many liberals would view America as a beacon of democracy, as the a very liberal country. But when they see the Trump's attacks on American establishment, and when they see the Trump try to build up a number of conspiracy theories, perhaps for many liberals in China now, they could truly believe that America is not really a democratic society, but it is a country that manipulated by the elites, and Trump represented that kind of force to anti-elites. So this is a really ironical change in the Chinese public opinion regarding the United States. So in that way, the current situation, above all, is not very optimistic regarding public opinion. On the one hand, we can still see a lot of Chinese who want to learn from America and go to America for study or live in America. In that way, that they still admire or love that kind of lifestyle, technology, or pop culture, business model, for example. But on the other hand, politically and ideologically, indeed, these two countries have become, regarding public opinion in China, America become more negative in recent years. So I think this ambiguous image of this conflict image of America will stay in China. And depending on the future contour of these two countries' relationship, if they get improved, perhaps the positive image will become more silent, vice versa. Okay, so this is my talk today. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Really interesting. Over to you, Dawisson, please.
Thank you very much, Asaf. Happy to be here today. Thank ISA for organizing the meeting. Professor Asaf Siniver for convening this team of speakers, and to think of such a timely topic for today's session. And I also thank Inderjeet and E for paving the way. So I should start with a disclaimer. I am a Brazilian citizen, so I really did not intend to provide you with not even a fairly balanced overview, which is representative of Latin America as a whole. It's quite a heterogeneous region So keep that in mind. This is a Brazilian, and there's always my background speaking. But from where I sit, I should say things look very interesting, very stimulating for an analyst at the moment. And I'm referring, of course, to the US-China global competition. Well, I believe the case of Latin America is very interesting. And if I may, we are probably speaking of the most westernized chunk of the global South. So I'll start with this theoretical claim. If you look at Latin America, you'll see a lot of resemblance with the Western world when it comes to religion. I'm referring to Christianity, but also to legal institutions. The Roman German system is all across the region. Market capitalism, representative democracy, not to mention our new Latin languages, Spanish and Portuguese. I mean, those are the most widely spoken languages in the region. So although we are not a part of the hardcore Western world, and we are not, but we are westernized way too much, I'm afraid. Since the beginning of the 20th century, when the US looked destined for greatness, destined for great power status, I believe Washington has become the most important external player in the region. So the US has been an important reference for us, for our foreign policies, for our societies, for quite a long time. The US has actually toppled Europe as the preferential ally, the preferential partner of our countries. Back in the early 20th century, the moment the US also became our top trade partner. So there's a lot of correlation between one thing and the other. The economic and the political domains, they have gone in tandem, one can claim. And I'd say Latin America has been under the US sphere of influence for a long time. The region has been or was under the US umbrella during the Cold War. This is easy to diagnose. But recently there has been a change. So this is what I want to focus on. This is what my talk is all about. But please note, and there are some important landmarks to bear in mind. Latin America has never embraced the non-aligned movement, or at least in the beginning of it, when there was the conference in Bandung in 1955, and then when the movement became institutionalized in 1961, there was no Latin American country but Cuba. Cuba would play a very prominent role, indeed, but we are speaking of a revolutionary Cuba, Fidel Castro's Cuba, the Cuba of the revolutionaries from Sierra Maestra. But all other Latin American countries would not take part in that movement. This is not by chance. I mean, there's something very deep about it. Because although Latin American countries would see and would recognize themselves as third worldist countries, they would never, ever put into play a Bandungish foreign policy, so to speak. Because, as I mentioned before, we were taking sides with Washington. That was clear all the way. But along the way, things started to change. And although there hasn't been a clear rupture, there was no rupture. the signs of an encapsulated tendency were always there. If one takes, for instance, the pattern of voting at the UN General Assembly, from the 1950s, it becomes clear that the whole region was distancing itself from the US from the 50s. And then there's a gradual movement of dissociation between Latin America and the White House and the Department of State. And I'm not sure it is a sign that Latin America was becoming more hostile towards the US. I don't think so. But definitely, it's a good sign of the region gaining autonomy in foreign policy affairs. That would be my bet. I would also draw your attention to one important fact. Over the decades, throughout the decades, from the 1950s, Latin America and the People's Republic of China have always converged in a very interesting, impressive way, I'd say, when it comes to votes at the UN General Assembly. Because after all, the same kind of structural problems would involve Latin America and China. I mean, they would be talking about the same kind of situations from a domestic viewpoint. I'm speaking of developmental issues or decolonization concerns or even denuclearization and topics like this. But there was a huge overlap between Latin America and China, which partly explains this convergence. So if on the one hand, Latin America has become more and more distant from the US voting pattern over the years, Latin America has always been side by side with the People's Republic of China. This is one piece of information not to be missed. I think this is important. And on top of it, in the last 20, 25 years, China has become our preferential trade partner. I mean, apart from Mexico and a few countries in Central America and the Caribbean, China is #1 commerce partner in Latin America. In the case of Brazil, I mean, it is quite telling. If the US was, until the beginning of the 21st century, Brazil's top trade partner, from the year 2009, China has taken over as #1. And now, as of 2024, China accounts for 31% of Brazil's exports to the world, 31, against 11% of the US. So it has been a dramatic change. The ground is shaking as we talk. And I mean, but this is the most interesting thing. And this applies to the rest of Latin America. To a higher or lesser degree, China has become a presence in the continent, a presence in the region, one that cannot be bypassed, not at all. But the thing is, if you look at the streets, if you walk on the streets of Latin American countries, if you go to Managua, Bogota, Buenos Aires, or Rio de Janeiro, you won't find anything like a Chinese way of life. Nothing that resembles a Chinese way of that. There's nothing like the US cultural influence. The influence exerted by the US is not the same, or is not even comparable to the influence China plays at the societal level. So the US still has an edge when it comes to soft power or cultural influence or cultural diplomacy. China still struggles with this aspect, with this issue. And this is probably where the US still has some advantage in this competition. But on economic terms, it is losing ground. It's quite visible. There's one more topic I want to address in this intervention. Possibly one can claim that there's some historical novelty in this third decade of the 21st century. And I'm referring to this very self-assured posture of Latin American countries when dealing with the very complicated issues of the war in Ukraine or the conflict in Gaza. They have refused as a whole. I mean, of course, there are exceptions to this, but in general, Latin American countries have refused to fill in a blank check and deliver to the West, to the US. And taking into account this increasingly bipolarized world where we live in, this is something meaningful. I mean, given that we live possibly, well, arguably, we live under a zero-sum logic today, if the US cannot conquer hearts and minds anymore, and if it loses some grip over Latin American leaders and societies, this should bear consequence in the mid and long run. So this is something for us to keep watching as events are still unfolding. Just to conclude my first intervention, interestingly enough, at the economic realm, Brazil and Mexico are so far the net beneficiaries of this competition between the US and China. In as much as China and the US put into practice their strategies to cope with the economic competition, be it called de-risking, decoupling, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever, Brazil and Mexico have become preferential destinations for investments coming from either China or the US. I'd say Mexico has become the US number one, second best, so to speak, while Brazil has become a preferential second option for China to invest its resources. And Argentina finds itself in a very complicated situation. In the worst case scenario, Argentina will not have, I mean, neither Washington nor Beijing to rely on, and possibly it has to undergo some course correction if it wants to recover access to funds and to investments, because the way it is at the moment, the prospects seem a bit gloomy for Buenos Aires. So for now, and to conclude, Brazil and Mexico have been able to sit on the fence. They have been exploring. They have been gaining from this bipolarization of world affairs. But I don't know, honestly, for how much longer they can keep this orientation in their foreign policies as the world becomes, and this competition becomes more and more fierce and demands from countries around the world, from global southern countries especially, to take sides and to decide where they stand in this competition. So let's see what the future holds. But I see a lot of difficulties for Brazil and the rest of Latin America as a whole. Thank you, Asaf.
Thank you, Dawisson. That was really interesting. Just a reminder, I think one or two people have already sent us their questions, which we will answer at the end. Do feel free to use the Q&A or the chat functions on your screen to ask the panelists your questions. Next is Jyhjong. I believe you will be speaking about US-China relations from an African perspective.
Thank you, Asaf, and thank you for the presentation, Inderjeet, Wang, and Asaf. Sorry, Dawisson. I have a PowerPoint to share, mostly because I am not very good at improvisation on the spot. So let's go with that. Share screen. So my presentation is a lot more micro. This is preliminary evidence from my fieldwork from mid-September to the end of October in Zambia, where I interviewed elites, political elites on their perception of the future of infrastructure financing in their own country, but also just in general in Africa as well. So I can't think of a lot of significant insights yet. So this is a bit of an info dump, but I hope you find this useful, since all of these are based on very recent events. And why Zambia? Why is Zambia a significant place for US-China rivalry? So historically, Zambia has had a very good relationship with China, and I'll go into that in detail of why that is the case. However, currently, Zambia does face a debt restructuring debt crisis, when they're in the middle of restructuring it, with China and France as two of the top lenders that are leading the restructuring effort. And this is coupled by the discovery of lithium and other minerals that are essential for the green revolution. So these are minerals for batteries for the future, right? So, and Zambia is also strategically located for DRC's export. So the DRC also has, in fact, it has more critical minerals in deposits than Zambia, but in terms of the ability to export it, to refine it into exportable shapes, Zambia is in fact one of the key gateways to DRC's minerals. And this coincides by a resurgence of US interest and the proposal of the Lobito Atlantic Railway. So a little bit about the history of Zambia-China relations. So unlike Latin America, African states are definitely a key player, are key players in the non-aligned movement. In 1965, when Southern Rhodesia, that is former current Zimbabwe, they had a unilateral declaration of independence by white leaders in their country, and that restricted Zambia's sea assets. So Zambia is a landlocked state. And at the time when Zambia reached out to international partners for support to break this embargo, essentially, neither side of the Cold War were interested in funding a railway that would do so. And primarily, this is a railway either from Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, to either Mozambique or Dar es Salaam. And in the end, it was China who funded the railway from Lusaka to Dar es Salaam. And this is both for diplomatic reasons. At the time, China was, as said before, was a revolutionary state, and they had ideological reasons to support them at great cost to themselves. And now China is one of the, Zambia is now one of the largest borrowers of Chinese loans. So this is a quick graph of what it looks like of how much Zambia borrowed from China. And this roughly mirrors the African continent as well in terms of the trend of Chinese loans to Africa. And so how about the US? What was US role in Zambia? Now, the US might not have as flashy a profile in Zambia, but they have been there for long. And for example, USAID is primarily active in health, education, water. The Department of Defense have military trainings with Zambiat, and you have Peace Corps, you have preferential for trade agreements. However, when I say they're not as flashy as Chinese projects, it's mostly because China specializes, well, in large-scale infrastructure projects. So these are railways, these are hydropower dams, airports, things that people in their daily lives can see, even if they don't directly benefit from it. Not everyone uses the airport, after all. And now there is a rising US interest in quote unquote hard infrastructure. So comparing to soft infrastructure, like we're talking about maybe education or sanitation, hard infrastructure are these large scale projects that are, I guess, visually more tangible. And this is not the first time the US and partners have tried to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. There are other efforts going back to the Obama administration. And the most recent iteration is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, the PGII. And this time, this initiative has more of a focus on hard infrastructure in order to compete with China. So what does the US offer? This is a proposed project that the US proposed to both Angola, Zambia, and the DRC. So this is the Lobito Atlantic Railway. I will zoom in on this a little bit in the next slide, but I just want you to note the locations of Angola, Zambia, and the DRC, as well as the Atlantic Ocean. So let's zoom in on this map a little bit more. So right now, what has already, the initial plan was to create for US and partners to invest and construct a railway from Lobito to southern DRC and Kolwezi. And in the past year and a half, there is a second additional proposal to expand a branch of the railway from Angola directly to Zambia, right? So the initial line bypassed Zambia, and now the second branch of the project will basically have a branch through Zambia as well. Now, why is Zambia important? Why is this railway important for the US? Why would they do this? And if you look at this map, this is where Zambia is connected to. So when I said earlier that Zambia is a gateway to DRC's mineral, it is because Zambia has road and railway connections to its critical ports for the export of minerals, right? So the US and partners will, their proposed financing will be a mix of private investment, public-private partnerships, concessional loans from a range of partners. And I think the reason why the second branch through Zambia was proposed was for hedging reasons. The DRC, even though they have a lot of deposits, they don't have as much capacity of exporting it. So having a line directly to Zambia is important for economical reasons, but also this is hedging against political risks. Political risk in Zambia is simply a lot lower than in the DRC. And if I have to take a wild guess on which branch would be finished first, even though the branch from Lobito to DRC was proposed first, it may be that the branch from Lobito to Zambia might be completed first, simply for logistical reasons. And what is the US official position on this project? So these are quotes from my interviews. The US wants to cast this not as an either or choice for Zambia, and is not meant to starve the Dar es Salaam or Tazara. Tazara is the Tanzania to Zambia railway. It is not an effort to starve Dar es Salaam or Tazara, or even the export routes through South Africa of traffic volumes, but this is a way to offer an alternative to the Chinese model, ergo the BRI. So, but at least during interviews, you can still feel that they are taking a few swipes at China, such as highlighting problems with transparency and the debt problems with the Chinese model. And debt trap, this phrase, is still occasionally leveraged without hesitation among OECD partners, even though most African respondents that are interviewed reject this characterization. And so what is the Chinese response to the Lobito, well, not so much the Lobito, the PGI in general, this US shift towards hard infrastructure? They see this, and a clarification, I was not, as an American researcher, able to get a hold of any Chinese officials in Zambia. They simply would not talk to me. So these are actually from articles that are published by state-owned media in China. So this is their position that state-owned media is taking on US interest in hard infrastructure in Africa. So they see this as US attempt to regain dominance in infrastructure, particularly greenfield infrastructure projects. And the US is targeting soft infrastructure that they have comparative advantages in, such as 5G networks, data centers, climate, green energy, and so forth. And they're also forming alliances with quote unquote like-minded partners, countries with similar values. Let's put it at that. And they also definitely see this, that they see the US as smearing the Belt and Road Initiative on project quality and transparency. And finally, they see this as a way that the US is trying to take control of emerging infrastructure sectors. So this is not the traditional roads or railways or hydropower plants, but a new generation of infrastructure such as renewable energy or 5G networks. And this is meant to block off the future of Chinese influence along the BRI. And while they admit, the Chinese side definitely do admit that this has the potential to become a competitor of BRI, but they also see this several weaknesses in this recent US effort. By the way, Asaf, if I'm going over time, please just yell at me, because once I do share screen, I can't see the time.
No, this is fascinating. I promise.
Okay,
that,
great. I'll keep going on. So Chinese perception of the US weakness on this recent effort is it reminds that the US and partners rely primarily on attracting private investment, even though infrastructure projects are generally unattractive for private investors. It's really hard to convince private investors that they're going to make money by building things like sewages or even roads are difficult. There are attempts to form PPP projects through allowing concessions to private sectors on collecting tolls, but those are still being tested as we speak. And the China also sees the US weakness in disagreements among member states of this blocs, right? So as you can see, the US is trying to gather as many international partners as possible, but the more partners you have, the more disagreements you will have. And also, at least within the US, changes in administration can easily sour relations with their partners. And finally, they see US weakness in and US partners is their imposition of political preconditions on African states. For example, LGBT issues is very unpopular in Africa, and even US representatives in Zambia know that there are areas that maybe back home in the US that people want to advocate for. They treat that, they keep that on the down low when they're actually on the ground. And how do China and US behave in Zambia? Like, if you look at the official media from Beijing and the White House, you would think they would come to blows on the ground in Zambia. But in fact, what I see is both the sides are treating very carefully. The US partners are careful not to identify, at least in writing, that China is the main target of PGII. And some admit that they may have to make strange bedfellows. Things might get awkward given Chinese dominance in infrastructure sector. For example, this Lobito railway project may need to be subcontracted, some portions of it, to Chinese companies, simply because Chinese companies have a lot of experience building railways in Africa. And China is also leaving open the possibility of PGI complementing or even cooperating with BRI. So they're not burning all bridges yet. So let's look at what Zambia is thinking after all of this is happening in Zambia. And Zambia's position is there is room enough for everyone. May the best offer wins, right? And even though the current Zambian administration is less pro-China than the previous one, I think in general, even my taxi drivers in Lusaka agrees that Chinese construction companies are still very competitive, even with the global decrease in Chinese loans. And when I ask about things like aid fragmentation, and the Zambian policymakers are not concerned about that. They feel like they have the human capital to manage it. There are like some concerns on compatibility of projects. For example, there's 3 different kinds of gauges in Southern Africa that needs to be somehow harmonized, but that is, for them, that's a logistical problem and not a political will problem. And finally, the phrase infrastructure arms race, I've seen that in some Chinese sources used negatively, and with the potential to unstabilize international security. But from what I feel among Zambian policymakers, it's like, this is great. Go ahead and race and give me a better offer. So it is to their advantage that people are competing to offer better deals to Zambia. Oops. Okay, and the thing is, with non-alignment, I find that non-alignment has to be maintained actively. It's not about not making a choice. It's about actively convincing all partners that they have not made a choice yet, but could be convinced to do so if offered a good deal. And that takes a lot of effort. When the current president, Hichilema, was elected, he made multiple international visits to both China and Western partners. And there are also project continuity across administrations too. The specifics might change, the financing methods might change, but for large key infrastructure projects, they they are not canceled on the spot just because you have a new administration. And there's no feeling that Zambia is being forced to choose sides. They have no appetite for it. And when questions concerning Chinese investment and potential for corruption or transparency, they are more willing to attribute that to their own politicians' moral failings than being accused of being naive, being fooled by China somehow. And my final thought is, in terms of infrastructure, there's a shift away from loan financing to private investment, and that shift is across Africa. And even Chinese companies themselves have to first adapt to the new financing environment. But it's unclear right now whether private sector could fill this large infrastructure gap. After all, even though private sectors might not have political conditions, like China might have fewer political conditions than Western partners, but they do have political conditions. Private sector might not have them, but they have no qualms imposing harsher financing or economic conditions because their mandate is to make money after all, not to support any political institution per se. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you. And I'm gonna stop sharing.
Wonderful, thank you, Jyhjong.
How am I on time?
Perfect. No, absolutely perfect. Finally, over to you, Ahmad, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Asaf, and thank you very much for having me today. If we are talking about the US-China competitions in Southeast Asia, then one of the most important thing that we need to consider is that there is no collective consensus on how to deal with the US-China with the US and China in the region. Partly because not only because of the fragmentation in the region, but also because of the history and the politics of the amity and enmity between Southeast Asian countries with both US and China. If we are talking about United States, for example, United States is now is currently the one of the major security partner for certain Southeast Asian countries, like Singapore, for example, or Indonesia to some extent, has established close relationship with United States. And then we are also talking about the Philippines, for example, which has a historical ties with the United States in terms of security and economic relations. And also, if you're talking about China in Southeast Asia, China has a very close historical relationship with Southeast Asian countries. For example, if we are talking about the Bandung Conference in 1955, the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was actually present at the Bandung Conference and gave speech. And at the time, China was actually had a very close relationship with certain Southeast Asian countries, and also there are some countries who has been historically close with China due to the political contestations, especially during and after the Cold War. But also, if we're talking about US and China competition in the region, we also need to consider the enmity between United States and certain countries in the region, and also China's enmity with certain countries. Vietnam and Philippines, for example, are the two countries who are most critical to China because of the China's maritime territorial claim in South China Sea. And this is something that is important because the Chinese maritime territorial claim leads to the rejection of China as a great power in the region because of the interventionist claim. But also, if we're talking about United States, the context of the human rights and democracy promotions was actually rejected by certain Southeast Asian countries. And despite United States close security ties, there are also kind of the criticisms towards the Western countries and the United States global projections of power, which some countries like Cambodia, for example, or to some extent Indonesia and Malaysia perceive as intervening to the region. So if we are talking about the Southeast Asian responses to both US and China, historically there have been the enmity and enmity that has been taking place in the region between United States and the Southeast Asian countries, as well as China and the Southeast Asian countries. So the question is, how does the current tensions between United States and China was responded by the Southeast Asian countries? So I have two major points here. First is that because of the fragmentations of Southeast Asian countries towards United States and China, there have been less coherent responses from the Southeast Asian countries towards the United States and China's competitions. Given China's positions as the great powers right now, and given China's maritime territorial claim in South China Sea, there has been a major criticisms from certain countries like Vietnam or Philippines towards China. And Philippines, for example, in the past year have been engaging with China in not only in territorial disputes, but also with the potential crisis in the South China Sea with the Sierra Madre ships, for example, that was caught and engaged by China's Coast Guard in the region. So if we're talking about this in this context, there is a very strong criticisms towards China in the region, and to some extent, it creates a sense of the ontological security dilemma for the countries. But at the same time, if we are talking about China as well, there have been incentives that China has offered to Southeast Asian countries. And this is something that certain countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Thailand perceive as a positive response with, for example, the Belt and Road initiatives. Indonesia, for example, is now one of the biggest recipients of the Belt and Road initiatives, and one of the success story of how the foreign investment coming from the Belt and Road initiatives leads to the major foreign direct investment in the country. And if we're talking about the election debates right now happening in Indonesia, the industrial downstreaming and the infrastructure project is now being hugely debated by the country. But at the same time, we can actually see that United States engagement with Southeast Asian countries, especially during Trump and Biden's administrations, is declining to some extent. The United States does not offer a concrete and tangible benefits from the Indo-Pacific economic framework, for example, which to some extent it makes the proposals from the United States is met with less enthusiasm from Southeast Asian countries. So economically, China is currently leading the way towards the current Southeast Asian context. And the United States economically is now a bit left behind, even though the security cooperations between United States and certain Southeast Asian countries is still going strong. So this is something that creates a security dilemma for Southeast Asian countries because of the current situations where United States and China engage in intense competitions that involve Southeast Asian countries, there is a fear from Southeast Asian countries that these countries will be dragged into the war or into potential crisis that they actually doesn't want to engage with. So this is the one of the main concerns that is coming, and then this is something that we need to consider the role of ASEAN here, the association of the Southeast Asian nations. So far, the responses from ASEAN as the biggest regional organizations in the region is actually weak. ASEAN only has the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, but does not have the operationalizations of the framework to deal with the potential crisis and the competitions between the United States and China in the region. And because of the less tangible efforts and less concrete approach that United States and China offer to the region, it is likely that the Southeast Asian responses to US-China competitions will be less coherent in the future. But I think in the future, it will also very much depending not only from the administrations of both US and China, but also the way Southeast Asian countries engage with the regional organizations. If Southeast Asian countries, if ASEAN could operationalize the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific with a stronger institutional measures, and there is a stronger push towards the negotiations in the South China Sea maritime territorial disputes. And I think this will, in the long term, it will create more coherent responses from Southeast Asia. Even though I think given the military and economic superiority of both US and China compared to the Southeast Asian countries, I don't think that the Southeast Asian countries will have the capability to engage with the potential crisis in the future. And what they can do is to boost the multilateral forum, to boost to ask US and China to engage with the dialogue, inviting them to the Asian Summit, for example, or inviting them to deal with the peaceful mechanisms of disputes and conflict resolutions in the future will be one way to make sure that the Southeast Asian countries can engage with the peaceful means to engage with the US and China. And I think this is something that characterizes the region so far. And one of the policy issue that we can look at in the future is the negotiations with the South China Sea. So the deadline for the negotiations between China and Southeast Asian China and Asian countries will be on 2026, and we will see if the negotiations can go with the good outcomes. And it is in this context that we need to take a look on how these countries will respond to the US-China competition in general. I think I'll leave it in this context. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ahmad. And indeed, thank you to all 5 panelists for their very, very interesting and insightful presentations. So we've got a few questions to kick us off. And again, like I said, feel free to send us your questions as we answer these ones. Perhaps we can start with 2 questions. I think they're quite similar about sort of the future trajectory of US-China relations in different areas of the world. So the first question for the group: with the decoupling of China-US protectionism policies and relations, what does this mean for economic and public policy upside opportunities for other Asia and Pacific countries such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and India? And the second question is quite similar. I would like to know the future power balance between the US, China, and Russia in Afghanistan or Afghanistan's strategic importance to the US and China, given that the US doesn't have a presence in the region anymore. Who would like to go first? Please, Inderjeet. And then you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question about the decoupling, and I think probably decoupling is too strong a term. There's certainly a selective kind of decoupling or attempt at decoupling in regard to technological kind of dependencies of the West and of China, of the US, but I don't think it's a decoupling. If we look at the what I'd use the term in my my talk, interpenetrations rather than interdependencies. And interpenetrations, we use that term and we see things that way. We see the United States and China are deeply interpenetrated, such that it's almost beyond comprehension that they could be decoupled. However, in regard to the securitization of certain aspects of the relations and interpenetrations, that is clearly undergoing some change. That may well open up some other opportunities, or it may well galvanize the other pro-American or less un-American partners in various parts of the world. That they may have a bit more choice, but I think that the kind of thing to look at is that these are not a zero-sum games which are being played, and it's not zero-sum power, but very large amounts of interpenetrations and dependencies and so on within a kind of a changing structure. So what I would say, I guess, is that there are far more powerful players in the world today than there probably has been for a very, very long time, if at all. And that means every state in every region has more opportunities and more choices to be made. That the US and China are not the only game in town, and then people can balance and counterbalance and multi-align or non-align as they see fit. And I thought the paper on Zambia was really interesting in that kind of regard. That and this is what some people argue, that multipolarity may well lead to a kind of democratization in world affairs. I would call it the broadening of the basis of oligarchy. They're just more powerful players, and I don't think we should attach the label democracy to them, because their elites are deeply self-interested, they are deeply selfish, and they use all kinds of rhetorical politics to whip up nationalism, to get behind them in their global bargains, but they use those to divide and rule within their own societies as well.
Thank you, Inderjeet. Yi, did you want to add something?
I think that if we look at the nomadic decoupling or de-risking or strategic competition between US and China, it indeed have a significant impact over the East Asia region. The first you can see is that the Japan started to dramatically increase its military spending for, well, mostly defense purpose. And meanwhile, you can see that South Korea now started to get closer with Japan, regardless of the historical disputes in the last years. And that's partly also because of China's, as you should say, the common threats. And meanwhile, Japan is also show some willingness to defend Taiwan if there's a war, which is actually very extraordinary, given the Japan's long-term post-war pacifist culture. In that way, I think Japanese now is considering there's possibility that the possibility to have a war with China over Taiwan has become a kind of topic now in Japan. And also regarding the economic situation, if currently China has been suffering from an economic slowdown, and that could, well, on the one hand, that could disrupt the supply chain or the regional economic growth, as Japan or Korea or a few ASEAN countries are heavily dependent on China's economy. And second, it indeed I mean, the decoupling or de-risking with the US and China, between US and China, indeed brings some chances, new chances for ASEAN countries, as the US now is moving some manufacturing base to Vietnam, for example. So in the long run, it really depends on how China could retain its strength in manufacturing industry, or whether China can how to say that, reduce the tension of economic slowing down. But generally speaking, I should say nowadays, indeed, I think the Eastern Asian countries, you know, they have to face a new situation, both opportunities and challenges now.
Thank you very much. See that Dawisson and also Ahmad, you've raised your hand. So Dawisson, would you like to go first?
Yes, just very quickly, there has been made it's been made reference to Pacific countries or Asia Pacific countries. And let us not forget that Latin America has some Pacific countries. Some of them even belong to APEC, and some of them are bicoastal, like Mexico. Others, like Ecuador, Peru, or Chile, are countries bordering the Pacific Ocean. So they might benefit as well from this competition in a very direct way. Just recalling some important bits of information, while Chile and Argentina have decided to adhere to BRI, Brazil and Mexico haven't ever embraced BRI. And this makes a lot of difference for these two countries, the US and China, because after all, Mexico and Brazil combined, they account for half of the population of Latin America and the Caribbean, and around 60% of Latin America's GDP. So apparently, if China doesn't find a way to attract Brazil and Mexico to its arms, to bring Brazil and Mexico under its direct influence, it won't win the long game. And this is something, this is one of the most important, I believe, takeaways if one looks at the situation in Latin America at the moment.
Thank you, Dawisson. Ahmad?
Yeah, I think with the questions of decoupling, one of the major issue in Southeast Asia is that it may create opportunities for Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, to some extent Malaysia, and also Laos and Cambodia to engage with China, because these countries are recipients of the Belt Road initiatives. But it doesn't mean that the engagement with China will be that peaceful because of the another tensions in the South China Sea region, for example, with the South China Sea disputes is not resolved between Southeast Asian countries with China. The risk is still there. And this is something that I think United States cannot actually play roles because of the perceived negative perceptions of the United States as a foreign countries who could intervene militarily in the region, and this is something that Southeast Asian countries actually dislike. So in this context, there might be some opportunities. But the question is not only about the United States and China, but also how these countries engage with Southeast Asian countries, which is actually more complex than simply about the coupling.
Thank you, Ahmad. So you have quite a few questions coming in. I think, as you mentioned earlier, if the panelists are happy to stay just slightly over time, then we'll continue, because I think there's some really good questions here. So next question, again, I guess you're welcome to respond briefly. How does the US respond to the expansion of BRICS and the growing interest of more countries to join the bloc? Jyhjong, would you like to go first?
I actually raised my hand for the
Oh,
previous
was that for the
question.
previous question? So,
Yeah, but
well,
that's okay. I guess I can give this one a shot. And this might be rolled into answer for the previous questions as well. What determines whether US wants to invest their effort diplomatically, economically, is whether there is a strategic interest for themselves. If it wasn't for the lithium and the critical minerals, I doubt Lobito Railway will ever be proposed. And let's not forget, during Trump administration, famously called African states a bleep hole country. That was the extent through which an US administration could distance themselves from partners, right? So if it wasn't for the critical minerals, I don't see that happening. And this might, I'm not familiar with China-Afghanistan relations, but from my feeling, and I would love to hear this from Wang, whether it's that China knows Afghanistan is a hot potato. So unless there is a strategic reason why they should increase amicable relationship with Afghanistan, I think the relationship will remain quite cool. But if tomorrow there's lithium found in Afghanistan, that would be another story. So it all comes down to whether it is of a particular interest. And something about decoupling, I know we mentioned earlier that Lopes mentioned earlier that China is meteoric rise to becoming the top trade partners with Brazil, but China is also the top trade partner with almost every country in the world. So it's really hard. It's really hard for me to imagine that China wants to particularly decouple. After all, that's, you know, export economy is what they rely on a lot for growth, and it's difficult for the rest of the world to decouple from China, and they are still the factory of the world. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jyhjong. Anyone else in relation to the question on BRICS? Yes, Inderjeet?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I guess I mentioned the BRICS and the new international economic order demands of the 1970s as very briefly in my intervention, and I guess I can amplify that point a little bit more. That when we look at Bandung, and then we look at the non-aligned movement, and then we look at the new international economic order demands in the 1970s, I think there's a kind of there's almost it's not a straight line, but there's definitely connections between the rise of the BRICS, or the sowing of the seeds for what became the BRICS by around 2000 in that broader movement. And I think we can locate that broader movement in the self-interested activities of all the major powers, the United States, and also of the major post-colonial states. And I would just point to an article in Foreign Affairs circa 1974-75 by someone called Thomas Farrar. It's called the Basis of Accommodation of the Third World, or something like that. And that's the height of the period of the demand for the new international economic order, which is, if you like, in many ways destabilizing or shaking the global order. Alongside that, West Germany and Japan are also demanding a greater level of status and say in relation to the United States, and you get the formation of the Trilateral Commission. That is, the conditions of 1945 don't prevail by 1975. And the consequence of that is things have changed. But the way in which the NIEO demands are handled is through a strategy alongside Henry Kissinger and many others of divide and rule. And in that article I just mentioned in Foreign Affairs, a direct analogy is made between how business elites handled militant trade unionism in the 1880s inside the United States, and how the same tactic can be applied to the militancy of post-colonial states elites in the 1970s. That is, you buy some of them off. So in that article, it subdivides the third world into basket cases, those which they believe are very too weak and poor to count, and into middle-class aspirational states. And those middle-class aspirational states would have a different strategy in relation to them. And I would argue, when you look down that list of so-called aspirational states, a lot of them end up in BRICS and BRICS Plus in 30 years or so later on. And those elites are far more integrated into the kind of neoliberal, globalized order and so on. So the United States, in effect, and other Western countries made an accommodation. Now they're reaping the benefits of that because they are no longer revolutionary, anti-colonial demands, although rhetorically there's a lot of anti-colonial rhetoric going on. These are basically elites which are renegotiating the conditions, institutional distributions of power and influence. They want to be closer to the top table, if not at the top table, in contrast with their positions before. That means the United States, if you like John Ikenberry says, this is in a way a kind of a success of the liberal order that the US leads, that they have integrated these powers, which could have been thorns in their side in a very radical way, like China was in the 70s or up to the early 70s, but they're not. They're integrated, but they just want a greater position within. And they want to therefore probably displace the US and the G7 compared with their positions. And so this is an elite renegotiation which is going on. The big question is the United States up to the task of reimagining a world in which it is not so dominant and has to negotiate with others much more? And I think the big problem is that the US system, the world system, is in a sort of challenge or crisis. But I think the biggest danger is what's going on inside the United States itself. I mean, just on Saturday, Trump said that the president should be exempt from any legal prosecution. That means he could stay in if he were to win, he could stay in for as long as he likes. He could just abolish the election in 2028 or whatever. So I think the big problem is what is going on inside the United States itself, and to what extent they're willing to engage with the world in positive kind of ways. And I think the messaging at the moment is not very good. And I think the ability of the US to accept some place other than where they are in terms of their hegemony, I think the ability of them to imagine that place, I don't think they are really imagining it at all. I think they are trying to hold on to their positions as far as possible. At the most progressive, they may want to shape or reshape demands, but I think they're willing to go to war on a number of fronts, usually proxy wars, in order to maintain their kind of hegemonies around the different regions of the world. And I think we're seeing some of that already playing out in Europe, in the Middle East, simmering in Taiwan in regard to the Far East, and it could well be breaking out in other places as well.
Thank you, Inderjeet. Dawisson, you've got your virtual hand up.
Very quickly and elaborating a bit further on Inderjeet's very enlightening words. I find the BRICS grouping fascinating as an experiment led by middle powers. So I believe this is substantively, qualitatively different from the NAM experiment a few decades before, and also different from the OPEC or anything like this. It's basically made up of middle powers. I mean, apart from China, all the rest could be classified as emerging middle powers. And they are trying to find ways to join what Professor Parmar has correctly, in my view, termed the expanded oligarchy, an expanded version of the global ruling elite. And there's one very challenging goal, which is for the BRICS grouping to maintain cohesive and to act as a collective actor, to move as a collective actor. And I don't think the US is very much interested in letting it happen. And I'm afraid it won't let it happen, or at least it won't just turn a blind eye to this process, because it might jeopardize some of the most well-established foundations of the world order. or maybe I'm just wrong. And as Professor Inderjeet has just claimed, the liberal order is so much ingrained, and those countries have already absorbed its contents in such a way that nothing's going to happen. So let's see what the future holds.
Thank you. Jyhjong, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think very enlightening from both Inderjeet and Dawisson, which is that I think the U.S. is coming into realization that there are other powers in the world are beating U.S. at their own game, right? We're trading more than you do. We're playing by your rules, and we're winning, right? And that probably doesn't sit well, at least for the more liberal side of the U.S. Now, at least during the Trump administration, I would say there's a bent towards more isolationist positions. And depending how elections play out and how domestic sentiments play out, there may be a general retreat of the US from the world. I don't know. I don't know what the next election would be like. But at least from researchers who are, in fact, more supportive of isolationism, from their point of view, and say, yes, let them burn. I don't care about their human rights record as long as they trade with us. Et cetera, right? So that could be the U.S. future. Who knows?
Thank you. So we've got another question about Trump. Given that Trump's return is likely, how do you see the Middle East, specifically Iran, playing a pivotal role with China in providing more regional dominance to China in the Middle East? Will the US, in that instance, use more hard power to regain control over the Middle East? And I suppose I'd just like to abuse my position as chair and perhaps open it to the group and ask you a broader question about the future trajectory of US-China relations until the end of this decade, really. If we see a Trump return to power, or do we see another Biden administration? What do you think either scenario is likely to do? How is it likely to impact US-China relations? And of course, the other regions in the world from your regional perspectives. Who would like to go first? Yeah, Inderjeet, please.
Usual, the biggest mouth in the room. I think about this question a lot, as I'm sure everybody here does as well. And I like your question about Trump, Biden, Trump. I mean, the questioner says likely return of Donald Trump. Well, I'm not sure that that's likely. It's more likely than it was. At the moment, we don't even know if he's going to be the nominee of the Republican Party yet. But still, I think if we look at Obama, Trump, Biden, then I think we see long-term continuities here in regard to the Asia pivot began under Barack Obama, taking China to the WTO dispute resolution and reporting them for all kinds of those practices everybody was talking about. That started under Obama's second term. The trade war and so on, and the kind of vilification of China in various ways started under Donald Trump in a very much more serious rhetorical way. Biden has not got rid of the trade war and the tariffs and so on. In fact, he's intensified them and focused them much more on the technological competition between the two powers. So if Donald Trump were to return to power, the biggest problem would be a dictatorship in the United States, and not isolationism, as some people call it, but transactional internationalism. That is, you want to extract as much as possible from every single relationship without too much of a sense necessarily of a liberal order, which he wants to undermine in various ways, but the deployment of hard power and the weaponization of every aspect of American power itself. And that is what he did 2016, 2017 to 2021. And that is what he would promise to do. The difference, in my view, is that the rhetoric and the mood music would change greatly, we know. But, you know, he said all that stuff about NATO. NATO's this, NATO's that, we're going to get out, we're going to leave you alone, we're not going to do this. NATO's obsolete. NATO's stronger in 2021 when he leaves office, spending much more money and deploying far more troops than it was before he took office. And the fact remains that the American foreign policy establishment, which is the red thread which joins all the administrations with a little bit of variation here and there, remains more or less intact. And their strategies don't change very radically over a short term, especially not with a change of a particular president. And they do as much as possible to try to maintain that trajectory. So in answer to your question, Asaf, I think in the next 10 years, I think there's going to be a greater level of probably selective disengagement or decoupling, far greater levels of militarization and weaponization, and the danger probably not of a, I mean, there isn't a Cold War objectively, but I think there are parallels between NSC 68 and the mentalities of the Cold War and the strategic, the act regard to China, which declares it a strategic enemy this last year, and which has the same kind of mentalities. And I think that's what they're going to try to do, is to try to discipline China. I think what we have to bear in mind is that even the European Union becomes an object and a target for the United States when they seek to be too autonomous. You talk about a European army, the United States does not like it. They want Europe to be more active, but under the American umbrella. And I suspect, and when Japan got too powerful in American eyes in the 1980s and so on, a racialized discourse about Japan and Asians and so on and so forth, and Pearl Harbor, 1941, all started up. When China's got into a position where it is no longer necessarily able and willing to be a junior partner and maybe opening its own account, then that kind of racialized rhetoric starts again. What did Karen Skinner, the head of policy planning under Trump, say? She said, China's a first non-Caucasian power that we've had to deal with. They're not even part of the Western family. They're not even Marxists. At least the Soviets were Marxists, and that is a Western philosophy and so on. We just don't even understand what the Chinese are about. That racialized attitude is deeply embedded, and that kind of sort of realpolitik and economic competition with hegemony is very deeply. And as I say, if you're applying to the EU discipline and to Japan, which is another ally, a discipline, then of course China is going to receive discipline or an attempt at discipline, because the United States believes, the foreign policy establishment believes, it controls the world, and it should control the world because it's good for the world, that it should be in charge. And anybody who gets out of control or who determines what should be the exception is going to face a little bit of a conflict with the United States. I'll stop there.
But for some reason, I couldn't hear the last 5 minutes of Inderjeet. What I'm sure was a fascinating answer. There's something wrong with my system. So until the ISA folks, can sort out my audio, Inderjeet is the eldest and wisest amongst us. Would you mind taking sharing responsibilities for me, please? Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Yi, did you want to say something about?
Can I continue? To answer the question, yeah, I think if Trump really becomes president next year, perhaps the current trade war or you can say Cold War technology will continue, unless there's dramatic change in say the regional situation or Chinese politics, but Trump could become more, if he really become more isolationist, he would ditch the EU and really be more tolerant on Russia, then that could have some complicated influence on US-China relationship. And it also will depend on, the future scenario between the two countries will also much depend on the Chinese economy itself, because the current situation is not great. So what will come up next in the next few years? If the economy is still going down or staying a low level of growth, then America can get more upper hand in the competition, and perhaps China could become more pragmatic because they really need more investment from the United States. So the last year was the first year since 1978 that the FDI in China turned negative. In that way, China really need much more investment from the West. So if that really the case, then US has more upper hand. So in that way, I would say yes. So domestic politics and economy in both countries could have a lot of say regarding these two countries' future relationship.
Go ahead, Dawisson.
So just add in my 2 cents. Speaking of the broad consensus with regard to foreign policy, take Latin America. This is a very interesting case. Which would be the probable US Latin America policy in the event of Trump coming back to the White House? I'd say it's confined to 3 topics, which are drug trafficking, the environment, and from a very negative perspective, one that emphasizes deforestation, environmental degradation, and basically immigration, illegal migration. Now guess how much different is it from Biden's agenda for Latin America? It's pretty much the same.
I'm Sarah Dorr with ISA. I'm just here for tech support and stepping in for Asaf. Does anybody have any other final comments, anything that they would like to conclude with?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, I think I'll respond the questions of the future. I think one of the questions from the Southeast Asian perspective is not only about the US, which is now declining in the region. Probably the focus of United States is now in East Asia with the context of Taiwan, with the questions related to the Ukraine and Russia, for example, but not in Southeast Asia. And the question is not about United States, but instead it's about how China would deal with the region and the capability of the China in the future. I think one of the most important thing here is about China's capability to deliver development and infrastructure projects with its economic partners, including in Southeast Asia, for example, in Indonesia or in Cambodia and Thailand. And the question of United States is now less prominent. And with I think as Dawisson has mentioned as well, if we are talking about Biden and Trump, there is not much difference about how Biden and Trump deals with the regions, except that Biden is more willing to have a negotiation and talk than Trump. And this is something that I think from Southeast Asian perspective, the question is not about Trump or Biden in 2024, but about Xi Jinping and whether or not China's Belt and Road initiatives will still continue in the future, and whether or not China's military modernizations will be complete in 2027 or it will be continued. So the question is about the more question is about China in this context. And I think I have also questions from let me see, from Arman Ahmed about the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East. So far, as Southeast Asian countries does actually respond to the crisis in Gaza, for example, but it's not a collective response. It's also similar in Russia and Ukraine. There is no collective response from Southeast Asian countries to this conflict. So what they do is to deal with the individual basis from the country, and this is something that they'll deal it separately without the involvement of Asian or the regional institutions. even though I think this is this creates a challenge to secure in the region in the future, because with the rising China and also the declining US role in the region, there might be more conflict and there might be more tensions, not only between US and China, but also between China and Southeast Asian countries and United States with Southeast Asian countries. So yeah, I think the scenario will be to through multilateral institutions, but I'm not sure it will be the most effective way.
Okay, well, with that being said, thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Asaf for organizing this. The Diplomatic Studies section has another event coming up in February. I am copying into the chat for everyone the link to all our upcoming virtual events. The next one that we have is part of our book talk series on religion and international relations. We then have a crash course in building an academic website for early career scholars, and the Diplomatic Studies section roundtable on publishing your research on diplomacy in academic journals. So please feel free to sign up for these. They are open to everybody. And thank you to everybody who attended today and for all of your thoughtful questions, and to the panelists for all of your thoughtful answers. ISA really appreciates it. So thank you everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.